In the glittering halls of the Zorgan High Council, an uneasy silence reigned. The gathered leaders, resplendent in their shimmering robes, stood motionless as the Grand Chancellor delivered the grim news. The Vortex have broken through our outer defenses, Chancellor Zorux announced, his voice heavy with sorrow. They will reach our core worlds within cycles. Our fleets are in ruins, our armies scattered. We stand on the brink. A wave of despair washed over the assembled counselors. The Vortex, an implacable foe that had swept across the galaxy like a plague, now marched towards the heart of Zorgan civilization. Mighty fleets, technological wonders, cunning battleplans, nothing had stopped their advance. Planet after planet had fallen, populations slaughtered or enslaved, once great species brought to the edge of extinction. And now, it seemed, it was the Zorgans' turn. What can we do? Councillor Velrak asked, her normally vibrant skin turned ashen. We've thrown everything we have at them. Every weapon, every tactic. Nothing works. Is this to be our end? Chancellor Zorux closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in thought. The weight of his people's future pressed down on him like a physical force. He had sworn to lead them, to safeguard their way of life, but in the face of this relentless enemy, he felt powerless. And yet there was one last desperate option, a gamble that could offer salvation, or doom them faster. We call for aid, the Chancellor declared, his eyes snapping open. We send a distress signal to the far reaches of the galaxy, to any and all who might hear and respond. We beg for help from any benevolent race, any civilization that might stand with us against the Vortex. Silence greeted his words. It was a bold plan, born of desperation. The Zorgans were a proud people, leaders in their region of space. To plead for assistance from unknown species was almost unthinkable, and yet, what choice did they have? It will be done, Velrak said at last, bowing her head. I will oversee the transmission myself. Let us hope that in the vast wilderness of the cosmos, there are those who will heed our call and stand with us in our darkest hour. Far from the besieged worlds of the Zorgans, on a small blue planet still new to the galactic stage, a young communications officer sat bolt upright in her chair. The signal that pulsed across her screen was unlike anything she had seen before. An alien distress call, a cry for help from the depths of space. With trembling hands, she forwarded the message to her superiors. Humanity, it seemed, was about to face its greatest challenge and its greatest opportunity. The question was, would they rise to meet it? The decision to aid the Zorgans did not come easily. Across Earth, debate raged. In political chambers, in public forums, in every home and gathering place. Humanity had only recently ventured into the galactic community, and many argued that the perils of the cosmos were not theirs to confront. They had their own problems, their own challenges. How could they justify risking lives and resources for an alien race they had never met? But others, driven by a fierce sense of justice and empathy, pushed back against such isolationism. How could humanity hear such a plea and do nothing? If they turned away from this call, what did that say about them as a species? No, they argued, humanity had a moral imperative to act. If they had the power to help, then they had the responsibility to do so. In the end, the vote was close, but the eyes carried the day. Humanity would stand with the Zorgans against the Vortex threat. And so, the great engines of human ingenuity roared to life. The distress signal had included what information the Zorgans had on the Vortex, and Earth's greatest scientific minds poured over every scrap of data, searching for weaknesses, for any advantage they could press. Weapons were designed, strategies formulated, massive warships constructed in orbit. In labs and workshops across the planet, engineers and scientists worked tirelessly, fueled by determination and countless cups of coffee. They knew they were racing against time, that every day brought the Vortex closer to total victory. As the human war machine geared up, diplomats raced across the stars, reaching out to other species who had answered the Zorgans' call. Alliances were forged in urgent meetings, with humanity often taking a leading role. Together, this multi-species coalition prepared to face the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. Commander Sakura Sato stood on the bridge of the UES Resilience, watching as the fleet assembled. Ships of every design and origin filled the view screens, a ragtag armada united by desperation and hope. In the distance, the swirling anomaly of the Rykos Rift crackled and flashed, the corridor that would take them to Zorgan space and the waiting enemy. Commander Sakura Sato stood on the bridge of the UES Resilience, watching as the fleet assembled. Ships of every design and origin filled the view screens, a ragtag armada united by desperation and hope. In the distance, the swirling anomaly of the Rykos Rift crackled and flashed, the corridor that would take them to Zorgan space and the waiting enemy. Sakura felt the weight of the moment, the enormity of what they were about to undertake. They were diving headfirst into a war they barely understood against an enemy that had never known defeat. The odds were stacked against them, and she knew many under her command would likely not return. But as she looked out at the determined faces of her crew, at the ships of their allies stretching out into the void, she felt a surge of pride and resolve. Humanity had made its choice. They would stand, they would fight, and they would show the vortex the mettle of the human spirit. "All ships, prepare for jump," Sakura ordered, her voice steady. "It's time we show this enemy what we're made of." As the fleet leaped into the swirling vortex, racing towards the unknown, a single thought echoed in Sakura's mind. "Whatever happens," she vowed, "we will make humanity proud." The colony world of Zorax Prime was a jewel of the Zorgan Empire, a testament to their artistry and engineering. Its gleaming cities rose like silver flowers from lush green jungles, its spaceports thronged with ships from 100 worlds. It was a hub of trade, of culture, of peaceful cooperation, until the vortex arrived. The attack came without warning, a swarm of dark ships dropping out of warp with weapons blazing. The Zorgan defense fleet, already weakened from months of war, crumbled under the onslaught. Fighters scrambled to respond, only to be swatted from the sky by searing beams of energy. In a matter of hours, the once proud cities of Zorax Prime lay in ruins, their inhabitants fled or perished. It was into this firestorm that the human-led alliance emerged, their ships dropping from the rift with guns primed and spirits steeled. Aboard the Resilience, Commander Sato watched the tactical displays with a grim determination. The vortex ships were monstrous things, organic and mechanical, melded into twisted shapes that defied comprehension. And there were so many of them, a seething tide of destruction that blackened the skies. "All ships, engage at will," Sakura ordered, her voice cutting through the tension on the bridge. "Fighters, run interference. Battleships, draw their fire. We have to buy time for evacuation." And so the battle was joined, the Alliance fleet plunging into the fray with desperate courage. Human ships darted and weaved, drawing vortex craft into the guns of their allies. Zorgan battlecruisers, their hulls scarred from countless battles, lumbered into the fight, pouring out sheets of blistering fire. And everywhere, the strange energies of alien technologies crackled and flared, turning the void into a kaleidoscope of destruction. On the ground, human Marines led the charge, their powered armor and advanced weapons making them a match for the vicious vortex shock troops. They fought street by street, building by building, buying time with blood for the civilian transports lifting off from the spaceports. Every inch was paid for in lives, every minute a precious eternity for those desperate to escape. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. Human tactics, unconventional and unpredictable, threw the vortex into confusion. Zorgan ships, their systems augmented with human tech, began to land telling blows, and the sheer tenacity of the ground troops, their refusal to yield, began to force the enemy back. But the cost was staggering. Ships burned and broke, their crews consigned to the cold embrace of space. On the ground, entire platoons were wiped out, holding the line to the last. And even as the vortex began to withdraw, It was clear that this was no true victory, merely a respite, a brief stay of execution. As the last transports lifted off and the order to retreat echoed across the comms, Sakura slumped in her chair, exhaustion and grief etched into her features. They had saved some, yes, but so many more had been lost, and she knew with cold certainty that this was just the beginning. The vortex had tested their resolve and found it strong, but the war was far from over. As the battered fleet limped back to the rift, Sakura steeled herself for the long fight ahead. They had shown that the vortex could be hurt, could be beaten back, but the road to victory would be long and drenched in sorrow. In the darkness of her quarters, Sakura made a silent vow. No matter the cost, no matter the sacrifices required, humanity would see this through. They had committed to this fight, and they would not rest until the vortex was nothing more than a bitter memory. In the wake of the Battle of Zorax Prime, the Alliance found itself in a grim position. They had bloodied the vortex, yes, but at terrible cost. Hundreds of ships lost, thousands of lives snuffed out, and for what? A single colony saved, a minor setback for an enemy that spanned the stars. If they were to have any hope of victory, they needed to change the game. They needed to take the fight to the vortex. And so, as the fleets licked their wounds and counted their dead, a new strategy took shape. The vortex armada was vast, its movements cloaked in secrecy, but it was not invulnerable. If they could locate its primary staging grounds, strike at the heart of its logistics and command, they might just stand a chance. To this end, small teams of elite operatives were assembled, the best each species had to offer, led by human special forces. These teams, equipped with the most advanced stealth tech and weaponry the Alliance could devise, embarked on a series of daring raids deep into vortex-held space. Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov led one such team, a motley crew of humans, Zorgans, and Kilushek skirmishers. Their mission: infiltrate the suspected vortex supply depot, gather critical intel, and sabotage as much as they could on the way out. It was a suicide run, and they all knew it. But they also knew the stakes. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Slipping past the vortex patrols was an exercise in nerve-shredding tension, every moment fraught with the possibility of discovery and instant obliteration. But Mikhail's team were the best of the best, their skills honed across 100 covered ops. They ghosted through sensor nets, slipped past guard posts, and wormed their way into the heart of the enemy stronghold. What they found there chilled them to the bone. Vast shipyards churning out nightmarish craft, planets cracked open and sucked dry to fuel the vortex war machine, and everywhere the signs of conquered species pressed into brutal servitude. The vortex weren't just warmongers, they were an extinction-level event, a plague that would consume the galaxy if not stopped. Steeling themselves, Mikhail's team set to work. They planted explosives on key structures, downloaded terabytes of critical data, and freed what prisoners they could. But as they made their escape, disaster struck. A hidden alarm triggered, and suddenly the full might of the vortex garrison was upon them. In a desperate firefight, the team fought their way to their extraction point, their cloaking devices shattered and their munitions running low. Mikhail watched in horror as his comrades fell one by one, buying time for the others with their lives. In the end, only he and a wounded Zorgan made it to the waiting ship, leaping aboard as pulse beams sizzled the air around them. As they limped back to friendly space, Mikhail nursed his grief and his rage. The price had been high, too high. But the data they had gathered would be invaluable. Combined with the reports from other teams, a picture began to emerge. The vortex were powerful, but they were not gods. They had weaknesses, pressure points, vulnerabilities, and the biggest one of all. Their command was centered on a single world, a nexus from which all their conquests sprung. In the halls of power, a plan began to form, a desperate gamble, an all-or-nothing strike at the heart of the enemy. It would require every ship, every soldier, every ounce of cunning and courage the Alliance could muster. And at the tip of the spear, leading the charge, the humans, with their indomitable spirit and their refusal to back down. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it, and pray that it would be enough. For if they failed here, there would be no second chances. This was the end game, the final roll of the dice. In the coming fire and fury, the fate of the galaxy would be decided once and for all. The Zorgan homeworld hung in space like a jewel, its lush continents and glittering cities visible even from high orbit. It was the heart of their civilization, the last bastion of their once mighty empire. And it was here, in the shadow of this world, that the fate of the galaxy would be decided. The Vortex knew it too. Their ships swarmed around the planet like angry hornets, a seething mass of nightmarish craft primed for battle. They knew the Alliance was coming, knew that this would be the final confrontation. And they were ready, eager to snuff out this last flicker of resistance and cement their dominion over the stars. But the Alliance had a plan, a desperate, audacious gambit born of equal parts brilliance and desperation. Even as their main fleet barreled towards the Zorgan system, a second force was already in motion. Slipping through the rift under the cover of cutting-edge cloaking tech, this smaller armada, led by Commander Sato and the Resilience, had one goal: to mount a rearguard action, drawing off as much of the Vortex forces as possible and buying time for the main push. It was a sacrifice play, and they all knew it. The odds of survival were slim to none. But Sakura and her crew, a mix of humans and aliens united in purpose, were ready to lay down their lives for the cause. They were the shield, the unbreakable wall that would hold back the tide, even if it cost them everything. And so, as the main fleet dropped out of warp on the edge of the system, Sakura gave the order. The cloaking fields dropped, and the Resilience and her escorts burst into view, weapons blazing, engines roaring, a defiant challenge to the might of the Vortex. And the enemy, sensing weakness, turned to meet them, their ships peeling away from the planet in a swarming tide of destruction. It was chaos, madness, a swirling maelstrom of fire and death. The Alliance ships fought with a desperate fury, their hulls buckling under the onslaught, their crews pushed to the breaking point. Sakura was everywhere, rallying her people, pushing them beyond the limits of endurance. They bought time with blood and fire, each second a precious eternity for the forces racing towards the planet. And now the main fleet was engaging, the might of 100 worlds bearing down on the remaining Vortex defenders. At the forefront were the human ships, their hulls emblazoned with the emblems of Earth, their weapons spitting fire and defiance. They crashed into the Vortex lines like a thunderbolt, their tactics honed in countless battles, their crews driven by a fierce, unyielding resolve. At the heart of the formation, Admiral Ivanov of the UES Titan led the charge, his grizzled features set in grim determination. This was the moment he had trained for all his life, the crucible in which humanity's fate would be forged. Under his command, the human ships drove a wedge into the heart of the Vortex formation, their guns never falling silent, their engines straining at the limits of their power. It was a maelstrom of destruction, a cauldron of fire and shattered metal. Ships died in droves, human and Vortex alike, their crews consigned to the cold embrace of the void. But even as their losses mounted, the humans pressed on, driven by a fierce, unquenchable fire. They would not yield, would not break, not while a single ship remained to fight, a single heart remained to defy the enemy. And now, the Zorgan evacuation was underway, thousands of ships lifting off from the planet's surface, fleeing the carnage above. They were the lifeblood of a species, the last hope for a civilization on the brink of annihilation. And it was the humans who made it possible, their ships forming an unbreakable cordon around the fleeing transports, absorbing the punishment the Vortex rained down upon them. But the cost was staggering. The UES Titan, flagship of the fleet, was a shattered wreck, its once mighty hull torn asunder by a dozen mortal wounds. Admiral Ivanov lay dead on its bridge, his last command a defiant roar of challenge as he rammed a vortex dreadnought. The Resilience, battered and broken, spun lifeless in the void, Sakura and her valiant crew lost to the pitiless depths of space. And yet, even as hope seemed lost, a miracle unfolded. A small human strike team, launched in the midst of the chaos, had managed the impossible. They had boarded the Vortex command ship, fought their way to its pulsing alien heart. And there, in a final act of desperate courage, they had detonated a zero-point bomb, a weapon of last resort that tore a hole in the fabric of spacetime itself. The effect was cataclysmic. The command ship imploded in a blaze of searing light, the shockwave cascading outwards in a rolling tide of destruction. Vortex ships shattered like glass, their crews vaporized in an instant. And with the loss of their guiding intelligence, the rest of the fleet fell into disarray, their coordination replaced by a mindless, animalistic frenzy. It was the opening the Alliance needed. Surging forward with renewed vigor, they tore into the disorganized Vortex ranks, scything them down in droves. And though the battle still raged, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Vortex had been broken, their aura of invincibility shattered forever. But the price had been paid in blood and fire. As the last Zorgan transport made the jump to safety, and the order to withdraw echoed across the comm channels, the true scale of the losses became clear. Hundreds of ships drifted lifeless in the void, their crews forever silent. Thousands of brave souls had given their lives so that others might live. And as the remnants of the once proud fleet limped towards home, a somber silence hung over every deck, every corridor. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The scars of this battle would linger long, etched into the very soul of every species that had fought here. But for now, in this moment, there was only grief, and a grim, iron resolve. The Vortex had been beaten back, but they were not defeated. There were battles still to come, wars yet to be fought. And humanity, bloodied but unbroken, would be there to meet them. For this was their duty, their calling, to stand as a shield against the darkness, to fight and die so that the flame of hope might never be extinguished. And fight they would, to the last ship and the last soul. For they were human, and they would never, ever yield. In the wake of the Battle of Zorgan Prime, the galaxy stood in shock and awe. The Vortex, the unstoppable nightmare that had consumed worlds and snuffed out civilizations, had been beaten back, their aura of invincibility shattered forever. But the cost had been staggering, the scale of the losses almost incomprehensible. For the Zorgans, the toll was particularly grievous. Their homeworld, once a shining jewel of culture and learning, lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its lands scourged by the fury of war. Millions had perished, their lives snuffed out in the crucible of battle. And though the evacuees had managed to escape, they were now a people adrift, robbed of their homes and their heritage. But even in this darkest hour, there was a flicker of hope. For the Alliance had held firm, the bonds forged in blood and fire proving stronger than the metal of any ship. And at the heart of this unity, standing tall and unbowed, was humanity. In the months that followed, as the Zorgans began the long, painful process of rebuilding, it was human ships that brought supplies and aid, human engineers and scientists who lent their expertise to the reconstruction efforts. The same indomitable spirit that had driven them to fight now drove them to heal, to rebuild, to stand with their allies in their time of need. And from the ashes of war, a new order began to take shape. The Alliance, once a hastily assembled coalition of necessity, evolved into something more, a true federation of species, bound together by shared trauma and shared purpose. At its heart stood humanity, a young race that had proven itself on the grandest stage, earning the respect and admiration of beings who had once looked upon them as upstarts and primitives. But even as the seeds of peace began to sprout, there were those who looked upon humanity with new eyes shaded by fear and mistrust. For in the crucible of war, The humans had shown a side of themselves that many found unsettling. Their ferocity in battle, their willingness to sacrifice, the sheer, unbridled power of their martial prowess. It was a reminder that for all their talk of peace and cooperation, humanity was a force to be reckoned with. And so, even as the ships of a dozen species flew side by side in the cause of reconstruction, an undercurrent of tension began to grow. In the halls of power, whispers began to circulate, whispers of human ambition, of a young race drunk on its own newfound influence. Some even began to wonder if the vortex had been the true threat, or merely a harbinger of the storm to come. But for most, such fears were drowned out by a wave of gratitude and goodwill. For whatever the future might hold, one thing was certain. When the galaxy had called, when civilization itself had hung in the balance, humanity had answered. They had fought and bled and died for beings they had never met, for worlds they had never seen. They had stood, unbowed and unbroken, against the tide of darkness, and in doing so, they had changed the face of the galaxy forever. And so, as the story of this great and terrible war passed into legend, as the sacrifices of the fallen were etched into the annals of history, a new chapter began. A chapter of uncertainty, yes, but also of hope. For the galaxy had seen the true face of humanity, and in that face, they had seen the future. A future of unity, of cooperation, of 1,000 different species working as one to build something greater than themselves. A future where the horrors of war were a distant memory, where the light of peace and progress shone bright and unending. A future that, for all its challenges and all its trials, was still worth fighting for. A future that, in the end, would be defined not by the wars of the past, but by the boundless potential of the beings who had the courage to dream it. And at the heart of that future, standing tall and proud, would be humanity, the race that had looked into the abyss and refused to blink, the race that, in its darkest hour, had found within itself the strength to be a light for all the galaxy. For that was the true legacy of this war, not the scars it left, but the bonds it forged. Bonds of blood and fire, of shared loss and shared triumph. Bonds that would endure long after the last shot was fired, the last ship limped home to port. Bonds that would, in the fullness of time, reshape the very fabric of the cosmos, and light the way to a brighter tomorrow for all the beings who called the stars their home.